All right, it looks like we're in business. For our keynote lecture, I'm very happy to have with us Hemant Dandekar from coming to us all the way from Switzerland. I think he's going to go through a bit of his career, so I'll keep that brief. But he's a distinguished alumnus of the department, earned his PhD, I believe, in 1991, working with our enthusiastic old friend Vladimir Levacek. And I'm sure there's stories there too, but I think we'll start after that point. And went on to work in a variety of positions with great success, both large multinational companies like Eastman Chemical and also some privately held companies, and hoping that he's going to share with students some of the lessons learned, and that you will be formulating insightful questions as we go along. The hope is to leave significant time for questions and discussions so that y'all can benefit from his many years of experience.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Well, good day. Mostly you should say good afternoon, but I'm so used to working with the international groups on the conference calls that it's always not day somewhere else. So we just decide to use good day in our calls. That's sort of the nature of global world that we live in. I was doing some research. So I haven't done any research presentations in a while, and I haven't mostly done business presentations. And I said, how do you give a non-business, non-research talk, right? So I started doing some research, of course, and came across, I think it was one of the TED how-tos, and they said, you should start with one of these 26 things, which would make your talk look impressive. And there was things like some amazing statistics like, I've been in the US for 13,971 days, or a classic joke, which all of you guys know, the advisor lion joke. I guess you don't, so maybe we'll keep it for the later. Or you might talk a little bit about a famous quote by somebody like Heraclitus said, the only constant is change. And so I started thinking about all those, and I said, well, if I just mention all these things, I've already started my talk. So let's get going, right? Okay, so why did I choose that title? It's kind of interesting that what can you do with your PhD? And what you think you're not doing with your PhD, but you're using it anyway. And I think that's what I want to explore, because the thinking and the processes is what matters and not what the subject is. So let's talk a little bit about that. Before I go further, let me introduce my employer, who has kept me gainfully busy for the past 7-8 years, since this is my round 2 with them, so that gives you an idea of how complex life I lived. It's called a leading sustainable innovation company, or that's what we like to call ourselves. The sustainability stuff is real for us. We are going to invest between now and 2026 about $1.5 billion for 3 plastics recycling facilities, which is going to process about 250 million pounds of plastic waste. And how much is that? Well, think about 3 football stadiums filled with plastic waste to the top. That's how much we would process 1 year. So we developed some technology which is called methanolysis, which does molecular recycling, which you basically reclaim part of your original monomers from polymers and reuse them. So I think of them as leasing molecules. So once you take them out of the earth, you can use it again and again and then recycle them. So 2022 revenues of about 10 billion. We basically think of ourselves as a materials and specialty additives company. And there are 4 business segments, about 14,500 people, and we do business in more than 100 countries. if you look at sort of the distribution, it is not a majority US sales company. It's split all over the world, about 45% in the US and about 26 in Europe and 23 in China. The business I run is actually close to 50% in Europe, and the other two split in China and North America and Latin America. So these businesses are very global, and a lot of the US companies now are in a situation when a majority of their business comes overseas. And I think there are some statistics about the locations. So there are 4 key lines of business. The additives and functional products, this things goes like dispersion agents in paints, for example, or flow agents for auto paints. The advanced material business, which is what I'm part of, is basically polymers which are used in advanced applications. There's a chemical intermediates business, which also does a lot of agrochemicals. And then we have a fibers business, which has now diversified into sustainable fibers for fast fashion. So H&M, Zara, and all those would be our customers. So it's a company which is trying to transform itself into a sustainable portfolio and move forward. So the business I am involved with is called Interlayers. And I guess most of you drive here. And how many of you know what is the composition of the glass in your windshield? Is it just glass, or is it polycarbonate, or is it something else?
There is a plastic layer in the middle.
Sorry?
There is a plastic layer in the middle so it doesn't shatter.
Exactly. So that's wonderful. So good job. So yeah, so this is called an interlayer, right? And that's the business I'm in. So what we're trying to do, so there are two pieces of glass, which is the upper and lower part of the windshield, right? And in the middle, there is usually either a single layer or a tri-layer film, which would have 2 skin layers and then a core layer. The core layer is usually softer than the skin layers. And the core layer absorbs sound. And that's one of the main ways you can overcome the sound which comes inside because of wind noise going around the side view mirrors and so on. So you can do other things, like you could add color to the external films, and it becomes like a colored glass. Or you could add additives like transition metal and rare earth oxides, which absorb infrared radiation. Or you could put a thin layer of sputtered metal coating, and then it acts like a reflective IR layer. So what appears to be a very simple windshield is actually a very complex piece of engineering. And there you have a polymer layer which is only about 0.76 millimeter thick, and it has 3 layers in it, and you need to be extremely precise. And you sell hundreds of millions of square meters a year. So you need to get it right every time, because you can't have a defect in the field with a car, because you'll be very angry if your $40,000, $50,000 car is a defect. So that's the challenge. One other very interesting technology is what's called heads-up display. So in heads-up display, you project sort of parameters about your car, like the speed and distance and direction. It's directional guidance from the GPS. The problem is you have 2 layers of glass. So when it gets reflected back, you create what is called a ghost, right, which is a slightly imperfect version right next to it. So that ghosting needs to be eliminated. So just like you use correction on your glasses so that you can remove the ghost when you're seeing, you use a wedge-shaped interlayer, which is on the right, and then you get a perfect image. I wonder if this would work. I'm going to try. So this is a very short video. Let's see if the audio works. So this is a video of HUD, heads-up display. It's only about a minute, so hopefully it won't take that long. So that's the heads-up display. Okay, that worked, thanks. So all right, so more than 20% of the cars now, which are the premium cars, have this technology. And we are getting to a point where we overlay on it information from a computer so that if you're driving on the road and you see Starbucks, you don't see Starbucks till you're almost there, right? And you can see the sign. But here it will overlay Starbucks in a distance on your windscreen as if you're looking at it, but it's really not physically there. And so that's called augmented reality. So I didn't want to, do a lot of company advertising, but I wanted to show you that simple things like polymers and glass have now grown so much in application that there's a lot of technology and utility and convergence of various fields together. So let me start with who am I and what do I do, right? Well, first of all, when you start with saying who am I, are you defining yourself by a job, right? I mean, how often do you guys go into a party or at a cocktail party and then first question you ask somebody is saying, so what do you do? And should you be asking what makes you happy or what gets you excited? So I think it's really important that we keep what we do in perspective, right? That it's more important for us as who we are as a human being than what our job title is or what our career trajectory is. So, okay, so let me take the commercial director piece on because it's most related to the conversation today. And what is my main job? My main job is to forecast the future. And that sounds a little crazy. I'm not into weather forecasting. But I have to imagine what the world would be like 3 to 6 months or a year from now and get my business ready to face that world. Right? So when we started talking about in May or June that there was going to be a UAW strike and that's going to impact our business, we started planning 3-4 months before the strike deadline. Either there'll be a strike or not. So forecasting the future is really important. Also based on that, you make decisions which might be 3 or 5 years relevant later on. The other big part is innovate. We want to make meaningful products which would change people's lives in a material way. Of course, all this doesn't happen. You don't get to keep a job if you don't increase earnings every quarter, right? So you have to increase earnings in the short term and in the long term. So you need to have a plan for near term and the long term. And really what we do is make a lot of choices every day. We make a lot of choices on strategy. Where should we invest money in capital? Where should we invest money in innovation? And what segments should we focus on, and so on and so forth. So it's all about choices. And the choices are made based on your knowledge, your ability to tap into other people's knowledge, and to combine all that to come up with conclusions. So notice I use the word awareness. I didn't use the word expertise, right? So you don't have to have the expertise. You got lots of smart people who have expertise, but you should have the awareness of what they're talking about. And so in our case, polymer science, chemical processes, optics, acoustics, rheology, thermal management, EMI and light spectra, and of course the business things like strategy, marketing, finance, et cetera, et cetera. So all these capabilities or all these experiences, you don't go to school for any one of them, right? You basically pick them up as you go. So these are things you accumulate by a series of experiences. So I had a boss who told me, he says, you get paid in two currencies in your life. You get paid in experience and you get paid in money, right? So most often experience is followed by money, right? So don't always think about how much money you're going to make. Think about what experience are you going to get from it. And then how can you build those experiences into a meaningful career going forward. So let's start with the first phase of my career, which was in technology. So in 1991, there was no LinkedIn, right? And as far as I knew, there were very few websites. I think 93 or 94 is when they opened the internet to commercial use. How did I get my first job, right? Now remember, I was a PhD student. If I didn't get a job, I go home, right? Your F1 visa runs out and you're done. So there is an added pressure for you to get a real job. Otherwise, your family and friends back home will make fun of you saying, yeah, you were so smart, you went to the US, now you come back with nothing, right? So I did what anybody would do, which is go to the library and find a list of people who employ chemical engineers, and I send out 50 letters, right? And to whomsoever it may concern. That was very sophisticated marketing. And guess what? I actually had, out of the 150, one person replied. And what they were interested in is the work I had done for my master's, which was on catalyst regeneration. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So they called me and they said, look, we only hire people in the top 10 schools, mostly in the Midwest. And since you don't really qualify, I don't think while we're interested, we're not willing to pay for your travel to Chicago and interview with us. So I said, well, how do I break this logjam, right? And they didn't want me to come visit them yet. So I said, oh, the AICHE national meeting happened to be in Chicago that year. So I said, I'm going to give a talk at AICHE, and why don't you guys attend my talk? And if you like what I'm presenting, then maybe we can have further conversations. And they thought that was a great idea, and they ended up, two of them showed up, my future boss and a colleague, and we had lunch, and a week later they asked me to come visit their facility, and rest is history, as they say. So totally random, but once you have a bite, you really need to become as clever, or you improvise, or you change the rules so that they benefit you. Because I think it's a myth to say that this guy's really sharp, no matter what, I want him or I want her, right? Because most people have multiple alternatives. So you have to make yourself look better than anybody else. You have to change the rules of the game in your favor and not wait for the rules or play by the rules always, right? You don't want to do anything unethical or illegal, but things like corporate policies are meant to be adjusted to rather than circumvented, right? So I think that's an important part. So my PhD was in three-dimensional unsteady state modeling of combustion. And in those days, we used to have things called supercomputers, which are probably slower than today's iPhone. But, so we did a lot of computer modeling. The first day I landed on the job, they gave me two piece of coveralls, right? And it had a little vertical slot on the side. And I said, what's that slot for? He said, oh, that's where you put the adjustable wrench. And then for the next 3 months, I worked as an operator for 12-hour shifts from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And every 2 weeks, you change shifts. And they said, it doesn't matter if you have a PhD, everybody starts in the pilot plants. And so that was an eye-opening experience. And I went on to become a team leader and eventually the process technology center leader, where I had about a dozen PhDs, and we built computer models of about 85-watt process technologies and about 5,000 installations around the world. So it's a big operation. So what we were trying to do, or what I was trying to convince my management to do, is let's monetize these models to control or optimize refineries. Notice that last year's speaker, I think Maria was mentioning about RT-opt and real-time modeling. We had 85 of those, right? And everything was going well, and then one day the CEO said, sorry, we're not going to do this. And I'm like, oh man, why would he not want to do this? So I looked around and I said, who's making the decisions, right? And I said to myself, there's one thing in common. All of them have an MBA. So I said, that's a good scam to be part of. So I said, I'm going to go to business school and expose the scam, right? It's just basically flaky stuff. So I applied to Northwestern and Chicago, the only two good schools in Chicago, and went to Chicago and started the very first day. It was a Saturday, and there was a course in marketing and a course in microeconomics. And by the time, 6 hours later, my head was buzzing, right? And I was meeting my wife and in-laws in downtown Chicago, and we went into a Crate and Barrel store. And I was amazed because they were practicing the very pricing strategy which I had studied that afternoon. And I said, this is a pretty good scam to be part of. So over the next 2.5 years, I had a lot of fun, and my wife used to shake her head and say, I feel sorry for the rest of the class, right? Because I was just gobbling up as much information as I can. And the reason was, what you learn there is what you see in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times in real time. So you see the world unfold based on these theories. Don't want all of you to get an MBA and abandon PhDs. But all I'm saying is that there is always another dimension you can add to your capability. And that the more you do that, the richer your ability to process information becomes. So I decided that I needed to give this MBA thing a try, and I left UOP. But here's the thing, UOP paid for my MBA, right? And so I couldn't officially apply for a job through a career fair in the school because I was beholden to my employer, right? Which is fair. But I said, maybe there are some ways I can still make this happen. So for example, Shell would interview on the campus. So I said, hey, can you open an extra slot after your whole day is done so that we can have a conversation? And they said, sure. And so we convinced them, and they made me an offer in the management development program. Same thing with McKinsey and with, and there was a company called Enron. And they wanted me to work for them because I had a PhD in almost applied mathematics, given the work I had done. And they wanted to use my expertise in MBA plus applied mathematics to design futures and derivatives. And I said, it doesn't seem right because I'm still a chemical engineer, right? So you need to stay close to your knitting, as they say. And so I ended up saying no. And in the meantime, in one of our MBA class, there's this guy, this pretty young-looking guy, and he was talking about a small chemical company in East Tennessee, and they were using the internet to market their products and to sell products, transactions, everything. They'd already gone digital, and this is 1999, 2000 timeframe. And that company happened to be Eastman Chemical, right? So during the break, he was there for the whole class. I walked up to him and I said, I like what you guys are doing, but I think I can help you do this further. And the guy said, 2 days later, he gives me a call and he says, hey, would you like to come down and talk? And so that's how I ended up at Eastman. So they had a management development program. So the first job I had was in venture capital. And in about 6 weeks, I had made my first investment. And I basically ended up investing in 2 companies, one which is dead and one which is now a public company. But it's very sobering. Everything seems to be games for you when things are going well. But when you're sitting across the table and telling a founder that their equity is worth 0, that's tough, right? So I think it sobered me up very quickly that if you're in a boom, everything looks good, but when the boom ends on the other side, you better be ready to deal with the consequences. So as we were going through this phase, I took on, where am I? Okay. I took on a variety of roles, strategy, product marketing, and eventually there was a business which we had acquired, and the CEO was still with the firm. And he presented a strategy to my boss, and my boss said, hey, take a look at this. Does this make sense? And I wrote a scathing criticism of the strategy. And my boss changed the tense and the verbs and sent him back the email which I had written, right? And then, unfortunately, the CEO and our company parted ways. Unbeknownst to me, my boss had already nominated me to take over that job. And so I land in this place, and the place is in like total chaos, right? Because they just fired their CEO so many years. And this green guy who's never run a business before is now their general manager, right? So you fight through that. We sort of spend a lot of time on the floor, turn the operation around, and eventually became a global GM for that business. This is where Wall Street comes in. So the CEO doesn't like the earnings of the business. So even though it was profitable now, he publicly announced without me telling personally that they're going to sell the business. I hear that on a conference call, right? So I said, oh, well. So you end up learning a new set of experiences, which is how to live in a private equity world, right? Private equity is basically banks which own you instead of Wall Street or where your stock is not publicly traded. So I took the business private by the 3 or 4 of us who were part of the management team. We made presentations to a number of investors, and one of them decided to buy us, and they asked me if you would like to come with the business. Now, I could have stayed at Eastman, which is very stable, right? Or I said, hey, here's a chance for me to do something completely different, to be part of an executive team of a small business. But it was still about $700 million, so it's not super small. And then after I joined it, one of the big things we did is we bought AkzoNobel's resin business. So now our business was double of what it used to be. And I was responsible for integrating 10 sites from theirs with 7 sites of ours. And it was like spread across 16 time zones. So extremely long hours. You're awake for 16 hours a day, managing conference calls, making sure legal entities are created. Definitely not chemical engineering, right? But something about chemicals. And so at some point I said, I really need a 1 zip code, 1 time zone company, because I'm tired of traveling all over the world, and I'm tired of on 16 hours a day. So it's interesting. How do you get a job, right, after this? You need to keep all your connections open, right? You always need to tell your former bosses how you're doing. You need to ask them how they're doing. And somewhere along the way, somebody might contact somebody else, and they would say, oh, I thought I'd talk to Hemant, and he was looking for a job. And so most of the jobs you'll get is from 2 or 3 steps away from, what do they call it, the second layer in LinkedIn, second and third layer. So my boss got a call, my former boss got a call from a headhunter saying, hey, we're looking for a CEO who's not too old and who is adaptable even though he's from the big company. And my boss said, yeah, I got just the right guy for you, and he gave me the reference. So I interviewed with this company, and they decided they wanted me to come in and meet the management team since I was going to be the CEO. And they came in on a Saturday because that was the only time I had free. And I went in, and it felt like you walked into a Charles Dickens novel, right? It was horrible. It was like the 1980s. The company didn't even have voicemail, right? So if you got a phone call, just like in a gas station or in a repair store, they would announce saying, so-and-so's phone call, pick it up, right? And I was like, what happened to them? It's like the world passed by. And so I get to the airport in Nashville, and I said to my wife, there's no way I'm going to work here, right? And this place is like unbelievably bad. My wife said, hey, if you're going to be the CEO, you can do any change you want, right? So I said, okay. So one of the things I always did was, if they spent so much time with me, trying to tell me about their business and explain to me, least I can do is write a summary of what I saw and what I would change. So I put together a few slides about various changes I would make. And I had a call with the board, and I basically said, thank you, but no thank you. But by the way, you might find this interesting. And so I left that with them. 2 days later, the headhunter calls me. He's like, they really want you. And I said, but I don't want the job, right? And so in the end, I said, and I talked to a lot of my friends, and they said, look, it's not easy for anybody to get a CEO job, even though it's a CEO job of a small company. You should take the experience. I said, okay. So I took that job. Now I'm a private equity CEO. The first 6 months were great, and then 2007, the housing crisis hits, right? And what these guys did was they made parts which went into high temperature coatings, and they went into appliances, for example, which is tied to the housing market. So the market started plummeting. Then afterwards, they also did very large heat exchangers, which they would coat with glass so that they could be used in coal-fired power plants, right? So one by one, the coal-fired power plants are getting phased out with natural gas. So that's gone. A lot of the customers consolidated. And then there were new duties imposed on Chinese imports, which was the raw materials we used to finish. So these crises kept coming, and I kept dealing with them. But at some point, I should have said, do I still want to do this, right? Because 4 or 5 years of beating your heads is enough, but you don't need to do that for 10 or 11 years, right? So sometimes you can be victim of your own optimism. And so you should know when to cut bait, as they say. So this is the job I didn't want, and I stayed the longest in, 11 years, right? And so at this point, at one point I said, oh, by the way, it's really hard to rebrand yourself to come back to a large company after you worked for a small company in 11 years. People like, has he or she kept up with technology? Do they really can fit? Are they too independent? And so on. So I decided to take a step back in my career, and I say, I need to start back and sort of learn my way back into it. And so I ended up calling my friends at Eastman, and I said, hey, I'm looking for some options. And they said, all right, we'll keep an eye open. And then 2-3 months later, their head of strategy calls me saying, hey, so-and-so told me that you're looking for a job. I heard you're pretty good at strategy. Why don't you come and talk to us? And so I went back to Eastman, and they said, I met with the whole executive team because most of those were my colleagues then. Of course, 15 years later, they were all in very good positions. So I ended up back to Eastman, except I used to be a CEO. I had 150 people reporting to me or work in the company. And now I'm a strategy director, and I have nobody working for me. I just have an office, and I read reports, and I basically sit there and go in and go out, and people are all wondering, who's this guy, right? And so over time that changed, and then I started helping them out with enterprise strategy, which means I'd work with the executive team to help define the future direction of the business. And then I started doing consulting work for individual businesses, and that's how I got into the interlayers business. And at some point, they said, well, this guy knows enough about running businesses. He knows our strategy. He knows our business. Let him run this business. So the business I'm running now is probably about 50 times bigger than when I was the CEO, right? And it's profitable. Plus, it's got really cool stuff you play with. And it's very interdisciplinary. So career rehab complete, right? What do I do next? I have no clue. None of us do. So we just be ready for it. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about lessons learned. So when you are on LinkedIn, you only write about how great you are, right? Or there's this whole false, what do they call that? False modesty. There's a technical term for that, right, guys? Anybody know?
The humble bragging.
Humble bragging, there you go. So all you can do is have humble bragging, or you could do about all the great things you've done. Nobody talks about their failures, right? So I said, well, let's talk about my failures, because I've had more than my share, so why don't we have some fun? All right. So the first and foremost is don't let somebody else write your life story. So when I got into IIT, in IIT Bombay in the 80s, I loved airplanes, right? I loved flying. I loved everything to do with aeronautics. But I did not choose aeronautical as a major. Why? Because there was not that many jobs, and you would basically act as a mechanical engineer. If I had been in aeronautical engineering then, I probably have been designing the lander for the Mars, right? So you never know what would have happened, but you hear somebody else tell you a story, and you start believing it, it becomes your story. So make sure that if you have something which excites you, something which you want to do, don't let somebody else talk you out of it. At worst, it won't turn out the way, but you would have at least not the regret that, hey, why didn't I do this, right? So that's really important. When we were doing the PhD work, we were doing some work with the supercomputer centers, and our paper got nominated to be the top 5 sort of supercomputer modeling paper in a competition designed by IBM. And I could have easily pushed hard to IBM and said, hey, look, I'm one of the top 5 papers in your competition. Give me a job in modeling in IBM. But I never could gather the enthusiasm or the energy and break down the doors and say, hey, hire me because I'm good and I can do this for you, right? So if you feel that you're doing something really unique or novel, don't be ashamed of promoting it, right? Because you're not doing this to make yourself look good, but you'll be able to make a contribution in the right place where you're good at something, right? So it's really important. Get rid of underperformance fast. Sorry, I switched into more of business management, but if you have people working for you, and if there's a large group and one of them is not pulling their weight, if you don't get rid of them, the other 6 or 7 are going to feel like you tolerate incompetence, right? And they're carrying more weight because this person was not carrying their weight. So it's never too early to fire somebody which you know for sure is not contributing, right? So I've learned that over time, and I think those changes have to be made. The one I was talking about at my job as a CEO, you should know when to quit. So there's this lady called, her name is Sally Krawcheck, right? She used to be the CFO of Citibank and then president of private wealth at Bank of America. And she said, the day you quit your job is when you're flying on a transatlantic trip and you decide to watch a movie. Because if you really love your job, you'll work the entire way, right? So she said, that was a sign for me that I don't like my job. I'd rather watch a movie and order drinks, right? So it's important that don't overstay your welcome. If it's not working for you, I'm sure the universe has other things in store for you. I almost got fired about the prices. So when prices go up, raw materials go up, energy goes up, don't be ashamed to raise prices. The customers would always complain, but in the end, they want you to be around, right? So if you don't make money, nobody's happy. Your employees are not happy because they're not going to get bonuses. Your shareholders are not happy. Your suppliers even are not going to be happy because you're not going to have cash and you're going to pay them late and so on and so forth. So better to raise prices and lose some volume than worry about making ends meet. The last two are very, very important, right? So I don't think you can get work-life balance. What you can get is work-life integration, right? So for example, if I'm up at 6 a.m. having a conference call with China, then when I'm done at 8, I don't have to feel guilty about rushing to work by 9, right? I can take an hour off and have my workout, which I would have otherwise had from 6 to 7, because I deserve balance, right? So I don't think the rules should have been so tight that you cannot get yourself a break once in a while. And the last one, even if you have a highly supportive partner or a spouse, right, and they are your biggest champions, never ever take that for granted, right? Because while they might be really happy for your success for the next 5 years, but they suddenly find themselves being behind, you need to make that compromise and give them a chance to further their career. Don't wait for them to remind you that, okay, what's in it for me, right? So you need to have that in your mind. It's really, really critical. Then as I was thinking about this, I said, if I was in this hall and I was a 30-year-old, right, what would I tell myself? What advice or what input would I give to myself? So I thought I'd make a couple of lists. So the paths to career growth is not linear. Sometimes it is better to stay and figure things out. So let me see what that means. You don't always grow and saying that every 3 years I'll get a promotion. You might get 2 or 3 promotions in a 2-year period, and then for the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to be horizontal. And then there is again a raise and so on and so forth. Only in storybooks do people have linear career growth, right? There's always a lot of sideways turns. You gather a lot of experiences and so on. A lot of times we quit because we are feeling that things are not right and that maybe they'll be better somewhere else. But this is the opposite of know when to quit. It also means know when to stay and let things work out for a little while. Because lots of times we make changes because we think things are not going to get better, but give it some time. If it's not, then you can, of course, make the change. If you're looking for a promotion or if you're looking for another job in the business or in the technology area, and you hate your current job, right, then the tendency is to ignore or not do the job the best you can. Guess what? People notice that, right? So if you are not doing your current job well, there's no chance that they're going to want you to take the next job because they're like, well, he or she is not doing their current job well, how can I trust them to do better in the future? So irrespective of whether you don't like your job, anything which is given to you, you have to do the best way you can. Otherwise, the chances of even horizontal movement are very low. It's really important that you learn how to learn, right? Because as I showed you that big list, none of that list had sort of a course for it, right? A lot of the stuff is just learning by doing. So once you figure out the process by which you learn, you can make all kinds of changes in your life. Always tend to your networks. We talked about that. Somebody sends you an invite on LinkedIn, don't blow them off, right? At least tell them why you're not accepting the invitation. Always make sure that you say, please and thank you, and ask people, send them thank you notes, and so on and so forth. And don't be your worst critic. In the end, we are the ones who are our worst critic, and as a result, we put ourselves down. You need to have self-care. You need to have motivation. And if you're not going to hold yourself up, who else is going to hold you up, right? So I think I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right. Hope people were thinking up good questions. What brave student is going to be first? Priyanshu.
Hi. So UP, you mentioned you first was your first company after PhD, right? That's Universal Oil Products, if I'm not wrong. Then you did your MBA while you still had a contract with Lex.
I had a full-time job, yes, at UOP.
So, like, did they let you go of that contract easily?
Oh, no, there was no contract. It was just understanding, word of mouth. Yeah. Well, the way I think of it this way is that while that they're paying for my MBA, I continued to work for them. I didn't quit, right? So they get the benefit of me doing my MBA, contributing to the business for 2.5 years. So there is no guilt in me for that, right? Yes, sir.
How do you think your modeling background is helping you in your career?
That's a really good question. So I got this pleasant surprise. I was in Belgium, and one of our engineers had built this super elaborate CFD model of the car, and then we had converted the turbulence models into sound, right? And then we were modeling what was happening inside the car by that's how the sound waves travel through the film. And so when they were explaining to this, I actually knew what they were talking about. And they were going to present a paper which talked about, adaptive grids. This is what my job work was on how do you change the grid structure where the high gradients are. And it was amazing because this is like 30 years later, but I could understand what they were saying in great detail. And of course, I approved it, and now we use that as a standard tool to measure and define the sort of. So it doesn't really directly help you, but it gets you comfortable with things which at least you understand what they're talking about, but you might not have to originate it, but you can make decisions using that. So modeling's everywhere. I mean, a lot of finance modeling is, again, the same basic principles. Inventory is all mass balance.
What advice do you have for someone who wants to start?
Expand Oh God, there's so many ways to do that, right? So the first thing you do is go where there are people who are unlike you, right? So if you volunteer for an organization and you'd get to meet a lot of interesting people with, interesting backgrounds. Go to a conference or a trade show which is not part of your normal attendance, right? So you get to learn a lot about a new field. You get to meet a lot of new people, and that's another good way. You are in a big university. There are 28, 30,000 students here. Try to make friends with people from other departments. When I was here, I made a lot of friends who are from the dental school. Guess what? Because I didn't have any money and I was getting free dental care from them. And they're still friends 20 years later, 30 years later.
Maya. Yeah, go ahead.
So do you think MBA is necessary to become a CEO of a company, or PhD would make it one day?
I think it depends on the phase of the company, right? So if you have a startup, I think an MBA is probably almost a detriment because you're putting too much structure in, not being as spontaneous, right? So startups, not having an MBA is actually a good thing sometimes. But if you are running an established business, MBA provides a lot of the structure or the frameworks by which you can analyze what's going on. So it really depends on what stage company you're a CEO of. Does that answer your question?
Back in the back?
So you never talked about money in your presentation. How does that affect your job choice?
So you always want to make sure that you get paid fairly, right? So you never want to be exploited. And I always negotiate hard in terms of money because it gives me a feeling of how badly they want me or not, right? So I don't think of money as a goal, I think of it as a byproduct. And I had a headhunter and he had a great quote. He said, after the first 100,000, it's just a story we tell ourselves. It's like, oh, I need more money than that because I want to own a Porsche, and the Porsche is really important because it's part of my image and blah, blah, blah. But you don't really need that much money. Well, it's easy to say when you have it, right? But seriously, I think that it's a lot better to first really enjoy the job and going to work rather than doing it for the sake of money. You might do it for a little while, build up some reserves for yourself so you could do things, but you can't lead a whole lifestyle about just earning more money. That's not much fun.
Can you tell us the joke that you teased earlier?
Well, so there's this rabbit, and he's sitting by the burrow under a tree, and he's typing away on the laptop, I guess, and it used to be a typewriter. And so there comes a fox, right? And the fox says, "Hey, rabbit, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm typing my thesis." So the fox starts laughing, saying, "What kind of rabbit are you that you're doing a thesis? In fact, it doesn't matter because I'm going to eat you now." And so the rabbit says, "But I can prove it to you that I indeed have a thesis, and the thesis topic is how rabbits eat foxes." And so the fox is like, "Okay, enough, I'm going to eat you now." And he says, "Can I at least show you how I can do that?" And he takes him in his burrow and comes back, and there is no fox, and he continues typing. And then comes a wolf, and the wolf says, "Rabbit, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm typing my dissertation." He says, "What's your dissertation on?" He says, "What, rabbits eat wolves?" And he says, "That can be possible." He says, "Yeah, let me show you." And he goes down and comes back in and, finishes his PhD and gets a job in industry, right? Now there is... Of course, he won't make it to any of the academic places at that standard. But so you go inside the burrow, and there's a big pile of fox bones, there's a big pile of wolf bones, and there's a big lion sitting there picking his teeth. And he says, moral of the story is, it doesn't matter what research you do, it doesn't matter what research topic you have or title you have, what matters is who's your advisor. So when I told the story to my advisor, he said, "Hemant, you have become mature now. You're ready with your PhD."
All right, could we get the student speakers to come back up? We're going to wrap up, and we have always the ceremonial presentation of the little buffalo statues. So these are extremely special because the company that makes little crystal buffaloes stopped making them. And so this is like the last of the stockpile, and future speakers have to have these sort of like bronze buffaloes that look like they're jumping. Anyway, I like these better. So, as a token of appreciation for your talks, and we can ship it if it's